Hi, this is Dr. Franklin Allaire from the University of Houston downtown, and in this video, we are going to be breaking down quiz number 8, which focuses on Science Teaching Competencies 15 and 16, the first two competencies in the Earth and Space Sciences. This quiz, like all of the others that focused on the science content, was made up of 10 questions written in a style similar to what you'll see on the core subjects exam. Again, this quiz focused primarily on competencies 15 and 16, with a little bit of competencies 1 through 6 sprinkled in there just for flavor. All right, so here we go. Let's take a look here. Our first question in this quiz breakdown, a picture of a rock is shown. Here is our rock. And we can see that the edges, the outside of the rock here are rounded, but we have this big gnarly crack going right down the middle, and the crack has pretty sharp edges. So that tells us that this happened pretty recently. And so which process most likely caused the crack in the rock? So our choices are water freezing and thawing in the rock, wind blowing particles against the rock, water moving and dropping the rock, or glaciers scraping over the surface of the rock. And the answer here is going to be water freezing and thawing on the rock. So what happens here, so this is an example of what's called weathering. All right, and weathering is a little bit different than erosion, although the two kind of get put together in a lot of times. By the way, speaking of, these three other answer choices here are, in fact, examples of erosion. Wind blowing against wind blowing particles against the rock, water moving and dropping the rock, picking up and carrying the rock off, or glaciers scraping over the surface of the rock. All of those are examples of erosion. And this is going to come back to us in the next question here. But the difference between weathering and erosion is that weathering happens with that object in place. So water was seeping into this rock. It froze. When water freezes, it expands and cracks the rock a little bit. This, of course, allows more water to get into the rock, and which then freezes and cracks the rock open a little bit more. So over time, that freezing and thawing of water inside of the rock eventually cracks the rock open, and we see that big crack that we see in the photo there. Now that happens in place, and we see the same thing happening with our roads and sidewalks and things like that, where water gets into the sidewalk, it freezes and expands and starts to break that sidewalk apart, and starts to break the road apart. And this is how we get crumbling sidewalks, or one of the ways we get crumbling sidewalks and potholes in our streets. Now, when we compare this to erosion, and why don't we go ahead and go on to the next question, because that has to do with erosion. Number 2 is erosion is what happens when rocks and sediment are picked up and moved to another place by ice, wind, water, or gravity. So again, the difference between weathering and erosion is that weathering, it stays in place. That big giant rock is not being picked up and taken anywhere. Whereas with erosion, as we've seen with big storms like Hurricane Harvey and Tropical Storm Imelda, where things are being picked up and carried off and then dropped off someplace else, that is going to be the process of erosion. Now for number 3, we have this idea of plate tectonics, and there's a few different kinds of movement with plate tectonics. Again, just a refresher about what plate tectonics are. We have, of course, the different layers of the Earth, with the crust being the outermost layer. We have the mantle underneath it, which is molten rock, liquid rock. And so the crust floats on top of it, but not in one solid piece. It's a whole bunch of big pieces with continents and oceans and things sitting on top of them. And those plates are moving around, and sometimes they're moving towards each other, or pulling away from each other, or sliding past each other. So which of the following is not a type of movement with plate tectonics? That's going to be spreading. All of these others are types of movement. Convergence is where we have two plates that are coming together. Divergence is the exact opposite, where we have two plates that are being pulled apart, or being pulled away from each other is a better way of saying that. And then we have transformative movement, which is where we have two plates that are sliding past each other. So again, convergence is when they're coming towards each other, divergence, moving away from each other, transform is when they are moving side to side, they're moving past each other. And again, the only term here that is not a correct term for the movement of plate tectonics would be spreading. Number 4 asks us to match the land formation with the force that made the land formation. The only correct answer here, folks, is going to be a canyon at Palo Duro Canyon State Park being formed by a river. Canyons are formed by rivers. You look at the Grand Canyon out in beautiful Arizona, that is formed by the Colorado River. Same thing with any canyon we find anywhere in the world. Sand dunes are not formed by earthquakes. They are formed by wind, which is why sand dunes are always moving. The wind picks up the particles, carries them somewhere, and drops them off. So it's technically a form of erosion. A delta at the end of the river is not formed by wind. That's formed by water. It's formed by rivers. And a rock formation with layers on Mustang Island, it might be formed by ice, but because this is Texas, chances are that it's not being formed by ice. It's being formed more likely by the flow of water in a river. Number 5, rocks formed through the cooling and solidification of magma or lava. This includes basalt, pumice, granite, and obsidian. These are igneous rocks. Igneous rocks are rocks that are formed through the cooling and solidification of magma or lava. Now we have, of course, intrusive versus extrusive. Intrusive is where that cooling and solidification happen inside of the earth. Extrusive would be when it happens outside on the surface of the earth. Now, the other two main types of rocks are going to be sedimentary and metamorphic. Sedimentary are rocks formed through layering of soil and sediments. Okay, layering and cementification of soils and sediments. So just like we were talking about with layers in a river, you know, that rivers, water are picking up soil, picking up sediment, carrying it off to someplace and gradually setting it down somewhere else. So that those rocks and those sediments get layered and layered and layered, and they press down on each other, cementing them together and creating what are called sedimentary rocks. Metamorphic rocks are rocks that change from one type to another through heat and pressure. So they start off as one type of rock, maybe for instance, a sedimentary rock, and they get pressed into something else, again, through lots and lots of heat and lots of pressure. And classic rock, of course, is a subject of musical debate amongst lots of people. Our next question here, we had a student that read an article about natural resources and listed some resources like coal, petroleum, sheep, air, wheat, and lake, tree, natural gas, and fish. And so we're being asked which of these answer choices correctly categorizes them. So before we do that, let's just real quick define some things. So we have natural resources, and these are, I hate to define a word using the word, but I'm going to do that. Resources that are found in nature and used by humans and other organisms. Okay, because, you know, humans are not the only organism out there. We, of course, have renewable resources and renewable versus non-renewable. Now, a renewable resource is a resource that is for all intents and purposes unlimited or can be replenished in a relatively short amount of time, like a human lifetime. And I realize that we might be thinking, whoa, a human lifetime, that could be 70, 80, 90, or even 100 years. But in the geologic time scale, we are a blip on the calendar. Okay. And so, when it comes to Earth processes, we are measuring things in thousands and millions and billions of years. So 80, 70, 80, 90, 100 years, while that seems like a very long time to us humans, in the grand scheme of the Earth, in the grand scheme of the universe, again, it is a blip on the calendar. Non-renewable resources, this is a resource that is limited and finite. That's another way of thinking of it. Or can be replenished over very long periods of time. Okay, so we're talking, again, thousands or millions of years. And let me shrink this and move it over so people can see it a little bit better. And so looking at our answer choices here, there's really only one answer choice that fits this, and that's going to be D here, with air, tree, wheat, sheep, lake, and fish being renewable resources, coal, petroleum, and natural gas being non-renewable resources. Trees, we can cut them down, but we can replant them. Sheep and fish, they die off, or we might kill them for food, but we can have, new fish, new sheep are being born all the time, replenishing that supply. That's what makes them renewable resources. Number 7, the water cycle describes a path that water can take as it cycles through the environment. You have terms like evaporation, transpiration, precipitation, condensation, accumulation, and so on. And so in this question, a student wants to make a chart of the water cycle. Which sentence describes the process of condensation? Condensation, remember, is where water is condensing. It's changing from a gas or water vapor into liquid water. So water vapor collecting to form water droplets would be the most accurate statement in these choices used to describe the process of condensation. Number 8, the second atmospheric layer from the ground is going to be the stratosphere. And so there's a handy mnemonic device that you can remember to help you out with this. And that is the silly monkeys talked endlessly. This is a great silly phrase. Remember, the sillier or the dirtier you make it, the more likely you are to remember it. To put the layers of the atmosphere in order from the closest to the ground to farthest from the ground. And so we have, of course, our troposphere. We have our stratosphere. We have our mesosphere, our thermosphere, and our exosphere, which is the layer of the atmosphere that is farthest away from the surface of the Earth, and that's where we find things like the International Space Station, as well as some satellites that orbit around the Earth. Number 9, here's a diagram that shows a process over time. We can see that the land is actually growing with these different layers appearing. The amount of water is disappearing over time. And so the best answer choice for what this diagram represents is the deposition of sediments. These sediments are being carried in from someplace and dropped off, forming these layers that we see growing. In our second diagram, we see 2 layers, and then we see 3 layers, and then we see 5 layers in the last diagram, again, with the amount of water decreasing with every one of these pictures. And last but certainly not least, in this quiz breakdown, if we think about the carbon cycle, which is again similar to the water cycle, describing how water moves through the environment, through living and non-living parts of the environment. The carbon cycle is the same kind of thing. Instead, it's describing how carbon moves through the biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem, the living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So it's asking us here, what would be the most likely result from removing trees? Remember, trees, like other plants, are doing photosynthesis. They are taking in carbon dioxide and holding on to it, creating their own energy, creating their own structure. So less trees, less plants means less carbon dioxide would be removed from the atmosphere. And this is one of the problems that's happening with the human impact on the environment, is that we are removing plants, we are removing trees from the environment, which means that less carbon dioxide is being taken in, but at the same time, we are doing things that are putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So it's creating an imbalance in our atmosphere as far as the amount of carbon dioxide that's there. And so that's going to do it for this quiz breakdown. Our next quiz, which is quiz number 9, will also be focused on the Earth and Space Sciences, but it will cover competencies 17 and 18, which are the last 2 competencies for the Earth Sciences and also the last 2 competencies for our science teaching competencies in general. So thank you very much for watching. I will see you in class. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, message me, or talk to me before or after class. See you next time.